The clock on Gallagher's wrist read 13:47 hours. A cold, relentless rain had turned the Grosbeak Heights into a quagmire, sucking at boots and weighing down uniforms. Mud clung to every surface, tracks of half-tracks frozen in place, churned earth smelling of iron and rot. Gallagher crouched behind the wreckage of a destroyed half-track, heart hammering, adrenaline shredding the fog in his mind. 6 rounds remained in his magazine, 6 bullets to change the course of the day, 6 chances to survive. Through the grey haze, he counted the enemy. German infantry, advancing steadily across the broken landscape, were now 180 yards away. About 50 men, moving in a loose formation but confident, unaware of the trap waiting for them. Their faces, cold and determined, were ghostly through the rain-soaked air, rifles swinging with practiced ease. Gallagher's hands gripped the modified carbine he had spent 52 minutes, 52 illicit, painstaking, minutes altering in secret, knowing full well the punishment he would face if caught. Court-martial, dishonor, possibly worse. Every adjustment, every tweak, every careful polish of the trigger had been illegal. Every second of labor had been a gamble against regulations that would never understand why he did it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Around him, the other 5 paratroopers huddled behind fragments of twisted steel and splintered wood, their faces pale, carbines unmodified. The standard issue. They looked to him occasionally, a flicker of hope or desperation in their eyes, and Gallagher felt the weight of responsibility settle into his bones. This was no training exercise. This was no drill. Each man depended on him, whether they knew it or not, whether he wanted that responsibility or not. The cold bit at their fingers, and the mud made movement slow, dangerous, unforgiving. Every heartbeat was a countdown, every drop of rain a small hammer against the drum of anxiety. He thought of the 52 minutes again, the sweat and tension of bending metal against regulation, the quiet defiance of doing what he knew was right, even if it broke rules. Court-martial or victory, he whispered to himself, a mantra swallowed by the rain. Every other paratrooper's eyes were fixed on the horizon, waiting for commands, waiting for the first shot that might signal either survival or death. Gallagher's chest tightened. His fingers hovered over the trigger, reluctant to act too soon, yet unable to wait. Hesitation was death. The German line advanced, boots splashing through mud, rifles catching droplets of rain in their steel sheen. Every second felt stretched, drawn long like taffy, yet brief like lightning, an impossible paradox of time when facing mortal danger. The modified carbine seemed suddenly heavier, more alive than ever. It was as if every minute of illegal work, every act of quiet rebellion against the strictures of the military manuals, had imbued it with a singular purpose: to save lives, to turn the odds just slightly in their favor. Gallagher inhaled the damp air, tasted the tang of wet earth and sweat and fear. The decision was simple in concept, impossibly complex in execution. Fire and hope it worked, or sit and die under the grey sky with the mud consuming him. 1 round, 1 man, 1 chance, repeated 6 times. Each shot had to count. Precision was no longer a preference, it was a necessity. The men around him, 5 of his brothers in arms, shifted uneasily. Their carbines clicked and hissed in the wet, none of them modified, none of them gifted with the small miracle in Gallagher's hands. He could see the doubt in their eyes, the silent question that hung like smoke. Will this work? He could not answer them, not aloud. The answer lay in action, in the sudden flare of gunfire that would either turn the tide or signal their end. Gallagher's mind flickered for a moment, a fragment of memory. 52 minutes of bending metal, sweat sliding down his brow, hands trembling with anticipation and fear. Every moment spent on the modification had been a defiance of procedure, a quiet gamble against a system that valued rules over human life. Yet now, as the German infantry crested the next rise, it felt less like rebellion and more like salvation. The first man broke through a clump of trees, The second staggered into view, the third following. Gallagher's finger pressed against the trigger. The carbine responded perfectly, a whisper in the storm. And then the first shot rang out. Time fractured. The next second became both eternity and instant. Mud flew, rain hissed, shouts were swallowed by the wind, and the sequence of survival, chance, and defiance began. For Gallagher, there was no thought beyond the immediate. Nothing existed beyond the modified carbine, the advancing enemy, and the 5 men whose lives now rested upon a single, illicit decision. 52 minutes of illegal work had led to this moment, a moment that would define him, define his comrades, and perhaps turn the tide in a battle that could have ended before it had truly begun. And in the cold, muddy, relentless rain of Grosbeak Heights, Gallagher chose to fire. The M1 Carbine, light and sleek, was a weapon of convenience. At 5.5 pounds, it weighed nearly 4 pounds less than the standard M1 Garand's 9.5 pounds, a difference that seemed significant on paper, especially to paratroopers preparing to leap from aircraft into hostile territory. It carried a 15-round magazine, chambered in the .30 caliber, and promised mobility, ease of handling, and quick reaction times. Designed initially for rear-echelon troops, logistics officers, and support units, the M1 Carbine was never intended to be a frontline instrument of sustained combat. Its marketing materials spoke of a 300-yard effective range, a figure that would have sounded impressive to soldiers unfamiliar with its practical limitations. But in the mud-soaked fields, flooded canals, and rain-slicked heights of the Netherlands, that specification proved largely aspirational. For paratroopers, the advantages were clear. Jumping into enemy territory demanded careful management of weight. The M1 Carbine's light frame and relatively compact size allowed airborne troops to carry extra ammunition, grenades, and essential gear without sacrificing mobility. Its ease of maneuvering in tight quarters, over hedgerows and through ruined villages, made it preferable to the heavier, bulkier Garand. But these benefits came at a cost. Stopping power, reliability, and range, the very qualities required when facing a disciplined, well-equipped enemy in sustained defensive operations, were compromised. Operation Market Garden, which commenced on September 17, 1944, brought these weaknesses into stark relief. The plan was audacious. British armour was supposed to reach Arnhem within 2 days, securing a crucial corridor for the Allied advance into northern Germany. Instead, the tanks stalled, bogged down by terrain, enemy fire, and logistical miscalculations. The paratroopers, meant to seize and hold key bridges and heights only briefly, suddenly found themselves entrenched in prolonged defensive combat, exposed to continuous artillery barrages, small arms fire, and the relentless advance of German infantry. Among these positions, the Grosbeak Heights became critical, held primarily by the men of the 82nd Airborne. Here, the M1 Carbine's limitations could no longer be ignored. Weather compounded the issue. The unseasonably cold rains turned fields into mud baths. Canal water seeped through boots and clothing, chilling soldiers to the bone and corroding weapons in ways that manufacturers had never envisioned. The M1 Carbine, designed for temperate conditions and occasional field use, faltered under sustained exposure to moisture. Between September 17th and 25th, there were 347 official complaints of carbine malfunctions. These reports consistently highlighted 2 primary issues: failure to cycle properly in wet conditions, and insufficient stopping power beyond 150 yards. In practical terms, this meant that soldiers often had to reload or clear jams mid-engagement, sometimes repeatedly, and that targets beyond close range could absorb hits without immediate incapacitation. German troops, clad in dense winter wool uniforms, frequently shrugged off .30 caliber rounds entirely. The human cost of these mechanical shortcomings was undeniable. It is estimated that 23 American soldiers died directly as a result of M1 Carbine malfunctions during the Market Garden campaign. In one particularly grim instance, a paratrooper, firing at advancing infantry found his rounds repeatedly fail to eject. By the time he cleared the jam, enemy soldiers had closed the distance. Jam rates were calculated at approximately 1 in every 40 rounds under wet conditions, a statistic that reads abstractly on paper but translated to life and death consequences in the field. Soldiers became hyper-aware of these limitations, adjusting tactics, aiming closer, firing in controlled bursts, and relying on backup weapons whenever possible. Yet these improvisations were imperfect solutions, often adopted too late to prevent casualties. The discrepancy between advertised performance and battlefield reality revealed a critical flaw in military planning and procurement. Paratroopers had selected the M1 Carbine for its weight and maneuverability, assuming it would suffice for both limited engagements and defensive holds. Commanders, reading manuals and relying on manufacturer specifications, assumed the weapon would function reliably, at the ranges specified. In practice, however, the carbine was a tool designed for convenience, not endurance. It demanded maintenance, care, and dry conditions, luxuries that were scarce in the flooded, rain-lashed terrain of the Netherlands. Every jam, misfire, or failure was a stark reminder of the human toll of design compromises. Despite these shortcomings, the M1 Carbine remained a fixture of airborne operations. Its light weight allowed paratroopers to carry more than just ammunition medical kits, grenades, communication equipment, and other critical gear depended on the space freed by the smaller firearm. Its ergonomic design meant that, at close quarters, trained soldiers could still maneuver and react faster than with a heavier weapon. Yet these advantages could not compensate for the weapon's core deficiencies. In sustained firefights, at ranges above 150 yards, under relentless rain, the carbine was, at best, unreliable, and at worst, fatal. Market. Garand exposed the carbine's fatal flaws. A weapon marketed as versatile, effective, and dependable revealed itself as a fragile compromise. In the cold, muddy heights of Groesbeek and across the canals of Arnhem, paratroopers confronted not just the enemy, but the limits of their equipment, forced to improvise and fight, knowing that their lives could depend on the small difference between an idealized specification and the unforgiving reality of combat. Thomas Gallagher was 24 years old when the world shifted beneath his feet. Born and raised in Dearborn, Michigan, he grew up amidst the rhythmic roar of machinery and the smell of oil and steel. His father, a machinist at the Ford River Rouge plant, had introduced him to the world of precision and metal at an early age. By the time Thomas was a teenager, he could hold a micrometer and read tolerances to 1/1000th of an inch as naturally as he could read a book. He absorbed the lessons of his father like a sponge, learning not just the trade but the discipline, patience, and care it demanded. By 1939, Thomas had begun working at the Ford River Rouge plant himself. He specialized in tool and die work, a role demanding meticulous attention to detail. The machines he operated required precision beyond casual comprehension. The slightest misalignment could ruin an entire batch or cause catastrophic failure in an engine part. Gallagher thrived in this environment. While others complained about the monotony or noise, he found rhythm and satisfaction. Precision tolerances, repetitive calibration, and the constant problem-solving suited his temperament perfectly. His co-workers learned to rely on him for troubleshooting, and his father watched with pride as Thomas earned his own reputation as someone who could fix anything. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 changed the trajectory of Thomas's life. Like many young men of his generation, he felt the pull of duty, the imperative to serve, and the uncertainty of a world at war. By December 1942, Thomas had enlisted in the United States Army. Unlike some who sought glory or adventure, Gallagher's decision was methodical, calculated. He was not the type to rush into the fray without preparation. His path led him first to jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he endured grueling training that tested both his body and mind. The airborne courses were designed to transform ordinary men into elite soldiers, capable of leaping into enemy-held territory and surviving in hostile conditions. Thomas approached the training as he had every mechanical problem at Ford, with patience, precision, and a careful study of the systems at play. By April 1943, he was assigned to the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division. His technical skills, quiet temperament, and methodical approach earned him respect among his peers, though he remained reserved and understated. In June 1944, Gallagher participated in the Normandy Jump, a baptism by fire that would define the men who survived it. 72 days of combat followed, filled with chaos, destruction, and unimaginable hardship. Through it all, Thomas emerged without a single disciplinary incident, maintaining the composure and problem-solving mindset that had served him well in civilian life. What set Gallagher apart from many of his comrades was not just his technical aptitude but the breadth of his understanding. His years at Ford had given him a deep familiarity with gas-operated systems, timing mechanisms, and mechanical tolerances. Where other men saw weapons as tools of destruction, Thomas approached them as systems to understand, maintain, and optimize. He read technical manuals with the same eagerness that others reserved for novels, absorbing specifications, diagrams, and functional principles with a meticulous eye. In a squad, this skill made him indispensable. When a weapon jammed or a mechanism misfired, Gallagher was the man they turned to. If something could be fixed, adjusted, or improved, he would find a way. Yet, despite his technical prowess, Thomas was not a natural warrior. His strength lay in analysis, patience, and precision, not in bravado or aggression. Quiet and introspective, he preferred to observe before acting, to understand before improvising. This temperament, combined with his skill set, made him uniquely suited for situations that demanded ingenuity under pressure. While others might rely on instinct or sheer force, Gallagher relied on knowledge, planning, and meticulous execution. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His reputation within the 508th PIR was more than technical. It was almost mythical in its consistency. The guy who could fix anything. That label carried weight not because he sought recognition, but because he delivered results when others could not. Weapons misfires, vehicle breakdowns, improvised field repairs. Thomas handled them all, usually quietly, without fanfare. For his comrades, knowing Gallagher was near was a form of reassurance in a world where certainty was rare and survival often seemed arbitrary. Thomas Gallagher's pre-war life, his formative years in Dearborn, and his technical education at Ford created the foundation for what he would become on the battlefield. The combination of patience, skill, and intellect allowed him to see solutions where others saw only problems. It was this unique intersection of background and character that would later lead him to modify weapons in ways considered illegal by military standards, but necessary for survival. Long before the first jump, before the mud and rain of Grosbeak Heights, Gallagher had already cultivated the tools, mental, mechanical, and moral that would define him in the moments that mattered most. In essence, Thomas Gallagher was not born a soldier in the traditional sense. He was forged by industry, precision, and disciplined thought, and it was these qualities, more than raw courage, that would distinguish him in the chaos of war. The first death came on September 17, 1944, at 09:20 hours. Private Eddie Kowalski, Gallagher's best friend since arriving in England, lay sprawled in the mud near Grosbeak Heights. From Chicago, both had shared the same tent, traded letters and cigarettes, and laughed over cards during long nights waiting for the orders that would change their lives. They had jumped together on D-Day and landed together in Market Garden, trusting the other implicitly, relying on the other's presence as if it were a shield. That trust was shattered in an instant. Kowalski's carbine jammed mid-magazine as German infantry advanced. 60 yards away, the enemy squad pressed, forward, rifles glinting through the rain-soaked haze. Kowalski tried the standard tap-rack-bang procedure, a mechanical ritual meant to clear malfunctions, but the weapon refused to respond. The jam was absolute. Gallagher watched helplessly as his friend struggled, finally raising the carbine in a desperate, futile effort. The first German rounds hit, and Eddie fell, weapon still stubbornly jammed, mud clogging its action. Gallagher reached him within seconds, pried the carbine from his hands, and noted the problem: a fouled gas port and weak spring tension. The weapon, reliable under California testing conditions, had failed utterly in the cold, muddy, unforgiving Dutch terrain. The second loss came the following day, September 18th, 1944, at 14:45 hours. Sergeant Frank Murphy, squad leader and Brooklyn native, 31 years old with a wife and 2 children waiting stateside, had survived Sicily and Normandy, only to meet death in this foreign, rain-drenched land. The engagement occurred near Kiekberg, and the circumstances mirrored Kowalski's fate in cruel detail. Murphy's carbine fired 8 rounds before jamming. Trained and experienced, he switched to his sidearm, a .45 caliber pistol, but the range was inadequate. A German rifleman, positioned 140 yards away with a K98K, made the distance count. 2 minutes later, at 14:47 hours, Murphy fell. Gallagher, along with 2 others, recovered Murphy's body after dark, the shadows concealing both grief and horror. Examining the carbine, Gallagher recognized the same pattern. Mud fouled the gas system, magazine springs were weak, and the trigger required more force than a soldier could consistently deliver in frantic combat. Regulations forbade modifications. But the factory specifications had been designed for controlled testing, not the unrelenting, sodden chaos of Dutch mud, canals, and rain. Factory specifications that worked perfectly in California had killed men in Grosbeek. The deaths of Kowalski and Murphy revealed a painful, undeniable truth to Gallagher. These were not accidents, not mistakes, not errors of judgment by his friends or comrades. The cause was mechanical, systemic, and preventable. The gas ports fouled too easily, springs weakened under stress, and triggers were too heavy for consistent operation under duress. Each failure was predictable to someone who understood machines, someone who could anticipate the failure points in a system under environmental strain. Gallagher saw that clarity too late to save his friends, but soon enough to know what must be done. He began cataloguing the incidents in his mind. The weapons' failures were consistent. They followed a pattern that distinguished them from pilot error or poor technique. It was a mechanical issue, repeated across soldiers and situations. Mud and water clogged systems that were never intended to encounter such conditions. Springs, tempered for standard operation, lost tension under continuous cycling in damp, cold weather. Heavy triggers slowed reaction times, just enough to allow enemy fire to find its mark. Every report, every death reinforced the same lesson. The weapons that should have saved them were instead taking lives. Gallagher felt the weight of these losses like lead in his chest. Kowalski's wide grin, always ready to make a joke in the tent or in line for mess, haunted him. Murphy's measured calm under fire, the confidence that had steadied the squad, was gone. Regulations, designed to maintain order and uniformity, had failed utterly. They prohibited modifications that might have prevented these deaths, treating discipline as more important than survival. The very rules meant to protect the men had contributed to their demise. By September 18th, Gallagher's understanding of the M1 Carbine was no longer academic. It was personal. The weapon that had seemed light, manageable, and reliable in training had proven fatal in combat conditions. He saw a cruel irony in the fact that the men best trained, most disciplined, and most capable had been felled by machines that could not cope with mud, rain, and the human element of fear and fatigue. Kowalski and Murphy were no longer names in a roster. They were reminders of the price exacted by design flaws and inflexible regulations. For Gallagher, the path forward was clear, even if it was forbidden. The pattern was too obvious to ignore. Dead friends were telling him, silently and tragically, that adherence to regulations would continue to cost lives. To save the men who remained, something had to change. The tools of their survival, the carbines, the triggers, the springs, the gas systems would have to be modified. It was a choice between following orders and preserving life, between compliance and responsibility. And in the muddy, rain-slicked fields of Grosbeak Heights, Thomas Gallagher knew what he had to do. The regulation, manuals said no, but the voices of the dead said yes. Every jammed weapon, every life lost, had written its lesson clearly in the cold air. Survival demanded action, even if it meant breaking the rules. It was 21:30 hours on September 18th when Gallagher made his decision. The barn near Grosbeak was dark and damp, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of chilling rain. His squad slept on mouldy hay piles, cloaks drawn over their heads, exhausted from 36 hours of cold, wet fighting. Gallagher lay awake, staring into the darkness, unable to blink away the image of Eddie Kowalski's final moment, kneeling in mud, frantic hands fighting a jammed carbine before the bullets reached him. By 21:40 hours, he rose silently. No one stirred. He stepped across splintered boards, past sleeping men, toward a faint glow at the far end of the barn. Sergeant Bill Hayes of the 307th Airborne Engineers sat at a wooden crate, cleaning parts by candlelight. Gallagher approached. Hayes looked up, weary eyes showing both caution and curiosity. "I need tools," Gallagher said quietly. Hayes didn't ask what kind. Instead, he pushed aside an old blanket, revealing drill bits, files, a measuring caliper, and a jeweler's kit. "What exactly are you thinking?" he asked. Gallagher spoke with the precision of someone describing a machine rather than a weapon. He explained the gas system failure, the weak springs, the heavy trigger pull. Hayes listened, silent at first, then finally asked, "You know that's a court-martial, right?" Gallagher did not hesitate. "You know what else is?" "Being dead." They said nothing more. Hayes nodded slowly. The candle flickered in agreement. At 21:45 hours, they began. Gallagher used Hayes's calipers to measure the existing gas port. It read 0.0625 inches. Too small for wet, gritty environments. Too small to compensate for the sluggish cycling, caused by mud, water, and worn springs. He calculated the change in his head. To increase by approximately 25%, he needed to expand it to 0.078 inches. It was just large enough to aid cycling, but small enough to avoid catastrophic overpressure. He selected a number 50 drill bit. No power tools, only hand-turning slow, precise, controlled. The candlelight flickered across his face as the drill bit gnawed through layers of hardened steel. 18 minutes passed in silence, interrupted only by the rasp of metal and the dull rumble of distant artillery. When he finished, he wiped the port clean and blew through it, feeling the increased airflow. "More gas, more push," he whispered. Hayes swallowed. "Too much, and the receiver cracks." "Too little," Gallagher replied. "And it jams." The original recoil spring had 12 tight coils, the factory standard. Gallagher knew that in perfect conditions it was sufficient. But in Grosbeak, with rain, mud, and damp cartridges, the spring resisted just a little too much, preventing full cycling. He carefully clipped one full coil with Hayes's wire cutters, leaving 11. That was roughly an 8% reduction in tension, just enough to complement the widened gas port. Too soft, and the bolt would fail to lock or even fly back dangerously, turning the weapon into a hand grenade. Too stiff, and the same old cycling issues would return. He compressed the spring by hand. It felt smoother, balanced, alive. Hayes said nothing. The final change was the riskiest, the trigger group. The M1, Carbine's heavy pull, nearly 7 pounds, slowed response time and wrecked accuracy. Gallagher used Hayes's jeweler's file to reduce sear engagement from 0.065 inches to 0.045 inches. It took 19 minutes of quiet, controlled filing, hunched over a flickering candle. Shavings of steel dust shimmered in the light, like metallic snow. One slip would create a runaway trigger, dangerous, unreliable, unfit for combat. When he finished, he dry-fired the weapon 20 times. The trigger broke cleanly, without creep, approximately 4.5 pounds. Hayes exhaled after holding his breath the entire time. If you drop that weapon, it might fire on its own. Gallagher nodded. But if I pull the trigger when I need it, it'll fire. The work took 52 minutes. 3 Army regulations broken. Unauthorized modification of government property, unsafe weapon alteration, and deliberate defiance of ordnance procedures. Maximum punishment, dishonorable discharge, and 5 years in military prison. Hayes finally asked, quietly, "Worth it?" Gallagher didn't look away from the rifle. "Ask me tomorrow." The barn smelled of gun oil, damp hay, candle wax, and wet leather. Rain hammered the roof like distant machine gun fire. The candle flame danced in nervous patterns, stretching shadows, across the tools and the steel. Gallagher's hands were steady, unnervingly steady. Hayes watched in silence, nervous, complicit, and unwilling to stop him. Gallagher held the modified carbine in his hands. He did not smile. He did not feel relief. He simply whispered, "Now it might work." He blew out the candle. Outside, thunder rolled across Grosbeak. The rain had softened into a mist, hanging low and thin over the farmland like a tired veil. It was cold, damp, and raw, exactly the kind of weather that made rifles sluggish and trigger springs stubborn. Gallagher lay flat behind the wreckage of a burned-out German half-track, his elbows buried in the wet soil, his modified M1 Carbine cradled against his shoulder. His squad, 6 men in total, held a desperate defensive position along the road junction. Their orders were simple: hold at all costs. Across the open fields, approximately 50 German infantry moved with purpose, 2 assault elements from the 10th SS Panzer Division. The first group, 30 men, positioned toward the left flank, the other 20 spread along the right. They executed textbook fire and maneuver tactics, confidence evident in their spacing, their rhythm, their readiness. They looked like men who expected to win. 18 hours earlier, Gallagher had risked court-martial to modify his carbine. 52 minutes of risk. 52 minutes that could cost him 5 years in military prison or buy him 1 more day alive. Now, at 180 yards, it was time to find out which. PFC Jimmy Dietz peeked over the steel rim of the half-track, watching the advancing troops. "We're screwed," he muttered, throat dry. He looked at Gallagher, then at the untested carbine. "You better be right about that thing." Gallagher didn't answer. He didn't blink. He just settled the iron sight on the German squad leader's helmet-left group, about 190 yards out. Under normal conditions, that would be stretching the carbine's effective range. In the mud, rain, and wind, it bordered on wishful thinking. He exhaled, slowly. The trigger, no longer a stiff, factory-standard 7-pound pull, moved with clean, deliberate ease. Just 4.5 pounds now. No creep, no grit. The shot cracked. The squad leader dropped instantly. Gallagher didn't pause. He fired again, and again. The weapon cycled smoothly, without hesitation, without that sickening metal cough every paratrooper had come to fear a jam. The gas port, enlarged exactly to .078 inches, did its job. The recoil spring no longer 12 coils, now 11 absorbed and released energy exactly as Gallagher had hoped. No failure, no delay, just clean, efficient fire. By the 5th shot, Dietz was staring. "Your gun's working," he whispered. Gallagher kept firing. "Keep shooting." They did. The German left group hesitated, then dropped to ground cover, scrambling for ditches and shrub lines. Gallagher fired in controlled bursts 47 rounds in 4 minutes. His weapon never stuttered, never paused, never failed. The men beside him, however, were not so lucky. One jammed on his 3rd round, another had to strip his magazine after a failed extraction, one switched to his M1 Garand after his carbine coughed muddy brass into the dirt. But Gallagher's carbine illegal, unauthorized, but perfectly tuned, held the entire left flank. He shifted his fire right. 11 rounds targeted at a flanking maneuver. 3 hits. The German infantry scattered, abandoning their push. The right assault group surged forward, attempting a bold rush through open ground. Dietz, firing his M1 Garand, laid down suppressing shots, while Gallagher's carbine snapped through targets with unnatural precision, farther than any standard carbine was ever meant to reach. He tagged silhouettes at 220 yards, nearly 70 yards beyond factory spec. By 14:03 hours, the Germans broke contact. They withdrew not because they lost heart, but because they lost opportunity. They could not advance. They could not maneuver. They had been pinned by a single rifle that wasn't supposed to exist. When the gunfire faded, the battlefield was quiet in that surreal way. Only fresh combat zones can be neither peaceful nor calm, just temporarily silenced. American casualties, 1 wounded by shrapnel. No deaths. Gallagher's weapon. Hot, steaming slightly from moisture meeting metal, but clean. No mud build-up, no fouling, no sign of stress. The receiver hadn't cracked. The spring hadn't collapsed. The trigger hadn't failed. Dietz walked over, looking at it like a mechanic looking under the hood of an alien machine. "What the hell did you do to this thing?" he asked, running a finger across the bolt without fear. Gallagher just stared back toward the field, toward where Kowalski died 2 days earlier, clicking a jammed carbine while Germans advanced, toward where Sergeant Frank Murphy fell, firing a pistol at 140 yards because his rifle couldn't fire. He didn't answer Dietz, but Corporal Mike Santos did. He stepped forward, eyes locked on the weapon. "Can you do that to mine?" Gallagher looked at him. Then at the ruined half-track, the mud, the fields, the sky. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said, "but it takes 52 minutes. And maybe a little courage." The night after the firefight, the farmstead where Easy Company bivouacked felt strangely quiet, not peaceful, not safe, just quiet. The kind of quiet that came after men realized they'd survived something that should have killed them. At 1,900 hours, Corporal Mike Santos brought his carbine and set it on the overturned crate beside Gallagher. "Do mine," he said. Private First Class Jimmy Dietz followed with his, looking both embarrassed and hopeful. "Mine too." Private Lu Chen walked up last, carbine in hand, speaking without words. Gallagher hesitated, only once. By 19:30 hours, the barn was lit by 2 oil lamps and 3 candles. Hayes was already there, tools laid out neatly, saying nothing, but watching everything. And so it began again. The same process, gas port first, calipers, measurement, hand-drilled enlargement from .0625 inches to .078, 17, 18, 19 minutes per rifle. Then the spring cutting 1 coil, reducing tension by approximately 8%. Then the sear surface, filed down to .045 inches. Trigger pull reduced from 7 pounds to roughly 4.5. The work was slow, precise, and silent. By 22:30 hours, 3 more modified carbines lay in front of Gallagher. 4 total, including his. Hayes finally spoke. "You know this is spreading, right?" Gallagher exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said. "It should." September 20th. Company CP, 0900 hours, Lieutenant James Whitaker sent for him. Gallagher walked into the command post, expecting the worst. Charges, accusations, maybe even immediate confinement. Whitaker didn't salute. He didn't sit. He just held Gallagher's modified carbine and stared at it like it was both a miracle and a crime. "That shot yesterday," Whitaker said slowly. 200 yards. No jam, not once." "Yes, sir." Whitaker looked back down at the weapon. "Can you show our other mechanics how to do this?" Gallagher blinked. "That's allowed?" Whitaker gave a thin smile. "No. Very much not allowed." He picked up a pencil, drew a small circle on a map, tapped it twice. "Unofficially." That afternoon, Gallagher trained 2 company armourers from supply and maintenance. They wrote nothing down. They asked precise questions. They repeated every modification by hand until they got it right. By the evening of September 20th, there were 7 modified carbines in Easy Company. September 21st. 1,500 hours. The final tally reached 11 modified carbines. They didn't belong to just riflemen. Among the users were scouts, assistant machine gunners, squad leaders, and even 1 radio operator. Men who needed a lightweight weapon that wouldn't jam when they were face down in wet mud with artillery shaking the earth. All 11 performed perfectly in the skirmishes that followed. Not one malfunction. Not one jam. But every one of those men cleaned their weapon after every engagement, sometimes obsessively, almost ritually. Mud, carbon, oil, sweat, fear, all scrubbed off with quiet reverence. Because now, their lives depended on these rifles. The rumour network rumours moved through the battalion faster than orders. Soldiers rarely remembered exact distances in combat, but they remembered miracles. They remembered the moment when volleys from one position held off 30 Germans. They remembered the strange, sharp crack of a carbine firing beyond its supposed limits. They remembered that one rifle didn't jam, and they remembered who carried it. By September 23rd, Fox Company's armourer had visited twice, watching Gallagher's demonstration without speaking. He never asked for notes. He just memorized everything. Dog Company sent 2 men their weapons, tech, and a sniper. They stayed until midnight learning the trigger work. Nobody reported it. Nobody logged it. Nobody asked permission. Because permission was not coming. But death was. And soldiers, especially airborne soldiers, trusted survival more than regulation. By the end of that week, an estimated 27 carbines in the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been quietly, discreetly, professionally modified. No authorization from battalion. No acknowledgement from regiment. No inspection. No paperwork. Nothing official. Just soldiers keeping soldiers alive. On September 21st at dusk, Gallagher cleaned his carbine for the 5th time that week. Beside him, Santos cleaned his own, now identical in function. Dietz sat nearby, quietly dry-firing his weapon, smiling every time the trigger broke clean and crisp. Private Chen simply laid his rifle across his lap like a trusted companion and looked toward the fields where men were buried. Gallagher didn't speak. He didn't claim credit. He didn't seek approval. Because this wasn't about innovation. It wasn't about bravery. It wasn't even about defiance. It was about survival. 52 minutes of illegal work. To give fighting men a fighting chance. The morning of September 20th broke grey and cold over Keekberg Woods. Fog lingered between the trees, soaking the undergrowth and clinging to the uniforms of Gallagher's squad. Their patrol mission was simple on paper. Reconnoitre the nearby paths and ensure no German forces were manoeuvring behind Easy Company's main lines. In practice, it was anything but simple. As they rounded a small rise, they encountered a German squad, 12 men, armed and alert, positioned just 80 yards across the damp earth. The encounter was sudden. The Americans ducked behind trees and debris, weapons ready. 4 of the men carried Gallagher's modified carbines. The remaining 2 had standard issue. The firefight erupted and ended within 3 minutes. The modified carbines performed flawlessly. 0 jams, smooth cycling, accurate fire even through wet mud and soaked uniforms. The 2 standard carbines, by contrast, failed immediately. One jammed mid-magazine, the other locked entirely on the second round. The American soldiers adjusted, switched to sidearms or M1 Garands where available, and kept the Germans pinned. 3 enemy soldiers were neutralized before the remainder withdrew, leaving Gallagher's squad unscathed. By September 22nd, the pace intensified. Easy Company had been tasked with holding the bridge over the Maas-Waal Canal. Intelligence reported a German counterattack of approximately 100 infantry, determined to reclaim the Temeter strategic crossing. Defensive positions were reinforced, and Gallagher's 11 modified carbines were distributed across the line, positioned in prone and concealed spots among sandbags, debris, and mud. The Germans came in waves, their advance coordinated and relentless. The firefight stretched over 27 minutes, a long, grueling blur of sound and motion. All 11 modified carbines functioned perfectly. Not one malfunction. Meanwhile, reports from other positions, equipped with standard carbines, told a very different story. 14 documented jams, delayed responses, and forced reliance on sidearms. Despite being outnumbered, the defenders held the bridge. The Germans were repulsed, their assault broken against the disciplined, uninterrupted fire of the men equipped with Gallagher's modifications. By September 24th, the testing ground had shifted back to Grosbeak Heights. The Germans, clearly unsettled by prior engagements, began the morning with artillery, preparation. Craters pocked the fields, and a steady hammer of shells shook the ground beneath Gallagher's feet. Rain fell in heavy sheets, and the temperature hovered at 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Mud clung to boots and uniforms, water pooled in trenches, and the air smelled of wet earth and cordite. The infantry assault that followed was the largest engagement the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment faced during Operation Market Garden. Gallagher's carbine, carried in the same familiar hands, was put to the ultimate test. 83 rounds were fired under the harshest conditions yet. Heavy rain, mud, water, and prolonged, continuous fire. Every round cycled perfectly. 0 malfunctions. Every shot responded precisely to the trigger, each break smooth and predictable. After the battle, Gallagher and his squad inspected the weapons. The bore of his carbine showed carbon build-up, inevitable after so many rounds fired in such conditions, but there was no fouling. The enlarged gas port, meticulously hand-drilled, had allowed gases and debris to escape, preventing jams that would have been fatal in ordinary carbines. The reduced tension in the recoil spring absorbed repeated cycling without failure, and the lightened trigger allowed clean, controlled shots even in exhaustion and cold. The contrast was stark. Standard carbines, used in adjacent positions, had jammed repeatedly. Soldiers had been forced to drop magazines, pry bolts, or switch to sidearms in the middle of sustained attacks. In Gallagher's hands, the modified weapon not only survived but excelled, functioning exactly as intended under circumstances no manufacturer could have anticipated. By the end of September 24th, the battlefield had become a quiet testament to the effectiveness of the modifications. Soldiers carrying Gallagher's designs remained alive, their weapons reliable even in mud and rain. The success of the modifications was no longer hypothetical, it was, measured in survival, in maintained positions, and in the ability to repel assaults against overwhelming odds. The modifications had spread unofficially throughout Easy Company. But the results of this week of engagements made one truth abundantly clear. Design flaws in the M1 Carbine had been deadly, but they could be corrected in the field by someone who understood mechanical tolerances, gas operation, and the realities of combat. Gallagher's work had saved lives not just his own or his squad's, but those of the soldiers who had quietly replicated the modifications. By the time the regiment settled into brief rest after Grosbeak Heights, the morale among those equipped with modified carbines was noticeably higher. Trust in their weapons had been restored. Even in the heaviest rain, in the muddiest trenches, with enemy fire coming from multiple directions, men carried their rifles confidently, knowing they would fire when needed, reliably, without hesitation. For Gallagher, the week had been confirmation of both skill and necessity. 52 minutes of work, conducted under candlelight in a barn 2 nights prior, had grown into a small network of weapons that functioned flawlessly when the stakes were life and death. Every engagement, from Kiekberg Woods to the Maas-Waal Canal Bridge to Grosbeak Heights, reinforced the same lesson. Ingenuity, courage, and technical knowledge could overcome the limitations imposed by both design and regulation. In the field offices of the 10th SS Panzer Division, the air smelled of damp paper, cigarette smoke, and the faint iron tang of blood from the previous week's engagements. The German officers sat hunched over maps and reports, faces drawn from long days of fighting, long nights of uncertainty, and the creeping realization that Operation Market Garden was proving more difficult than anticipated. The after-action reports from September 25, 1944, were detailed and precise. Among the flag observations was a note that caught their attention and their concern. American paratrooper fire had been more sustained, more accurate, and more effective than in previous encounters. Machine guns and rifles had delivered consistent suppressive fire even under adverse weather conditions, and small squads had held positions that previously might have been overrun within minutes. The report speculated, the Americans must be receiving either better training or newer weapons. The officers were perplexed. Their intelligence had not indicated a change in American equipment, nor any significant influx of reinforcements to Easy Company or the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The analysts noted the unfamiliar tenacity and reliability of the fire, recording observations about reduced malfunction rates and unusual accuracy at ranges exceeding what was normally expected for standard-issue carbines. German intelligence officers had access to a number of captured M1 Carbines, retrieved from abandoned positions after the recent battles. Each weapon was carefully examined, field-stripped, and inspected for defects or enhancements. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. No external alterations, no suspicious machining marks, no visible differences from factory specifications. The barrels, stocks, magazines, and bolts all appeared standard issue. Internally, the mechanisms were not visibly altered in any detectable way without a complete teardown. To German engineers and armament specialists, there was nothing to indicate why these paratroopers were able to maintain sustained, effective fire under conditions that had previously produced jams, misfires, and weapon failures. The report concluded cautiously. The Americans may simply have been issued newer production models, freshly manufactured weapons that functioned more reliably in the field. They noted that manufacturing tolerances in American factories had improved over time and suggested that the superior fire may be a result of these improved tolerances combined with disciplined troops. The intelligence brief highlighted the persistent problem the Germans faced. Units that were supposed to be lightly armed and struggling with malfunctioning weapons were suddenly performing at a level that rivaled even well-equipped rifle companies. In reality, the situation was far more nuanced and entirely invisible to the German observers. Within Easy Company, by September 23, 1944, an estimated 27 carbines had been modified according to the techniques devised by Thomas Gallagher. Enlarged gas ports, slightly reduced recoil springs, and finely filed sear surfaces allowed these weapons to fire with unprecedented reliability under wet, muddy, and cold conditions. These modifications were subtle, nearly impossible to detect without complete disassembly and careful measurement, which the Germans could not perform under combat conditions. The German commanders could only observe the results. Men holding positions that should have been untenable, weapons firing cleanly where they expected jams, and fire delivered consistently and accurately across ranges exceeding standard specifications. They could not understand the cause. Their conclusions, better training, newer production weapons were logical given their information but fundamentally incomplete. The true source of American effectiveness remained hidden, a secret that might have saved lives but could not be documented officially. This invisible improvement created a quiet psychological edge. German soldiers on the receiving end noticed the difference firsthand. Carbine fire was no longer sporadic or unreliable. Suppressive fire maintained a steady rhythm, pinning soldiers in trenches and behind hedgerows with unnerving consistency. Attacks that might have succeeded previously were slowed, forced to retreat, or cancelled entirely due to the unrelenting pressure from paratroopers equipped with these modified weapons. Even months later, after examining the records, German historians and surviving veterans would note the anomaly of Easy Company's rifle effectiveness. Yet, in September 1944, the soldiers and officers on the ground could not know the truth. They could only write it in reports, mark it on maps, and speculate about new American production lines or the possibility of heightened training regimens. They never guessed the truth. 27 carbines, modified quietly by one methodical, determined paratrooper, had changed the face of several engagements in Operation Market Garden. And so, in the German reports, the story remained incomplete. The documents would eventually find their way to archives, curious footnotes in a larger history, detailing unusual American firepower. But the invisible modifications, hand-drilled gas ports, adjusted springs, finely filed triggers, would not appear on any official roster. They existed only in the hands of soldiers, in the rhythm of combat, and in the survival of men who owed their lives to ingenuity, quiet defiance, and technical mastery in the middle of a European autumn. Within the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, whispers of Gallagher's modifications circulated quickly. Officers heard of carbines functioning flawlessly where standard rifles failed. Soldiers spoke quietly of hand-drilled gas ports, adjusted springs, and filed triggers that allowed sustained fire under rain, mud, and enemy fire. Yet, no official investigation followed. No formal commendations were issued. No orders were sent from battalion or regiment to replicate the work. The unofficial policy became clear. Don't ask, don't document, and certainly don't write anything down. The reasoning was simple and unspoken. It worked. Lives were saved. Positions held. Fire delivered. Regulations could wait. Bureaucracy mattered less than survival in the wet fields of the Plate, Netherlands. Commanders tacitly allowed the modifications to continue, understanding the risks but recognizing the results. Gallagher's work remained invisible in reports, overlooked by official eyes, yet quietly acknowledged where it mattered most on the battlefield. After Market Garden, in October 1944, the 82nd Airborne was sent to France for rest and refit. The modifications were never mentioned in after-action reports. There were no commendations for Gallagher, no mention of the carbines performing beyond expectations. The Army Ordnance Department, responsible for weapon inspection and oversight, was never notified. Field manuals remained unchanged. Official production standards were unchallenged. The carbine was still officially considered a light rear-echelon weapon, despite what men in Grosbeak Heights now knew firsthand. The statistics told a different story, ignored by command. Prior to modifications, the regiment experienced a carbine jam rate of approximately 2.5% of rounds fired. After Gallagher's modifications, company averages fell to roughly 1.8%. Modified weapons individually demonstrated a jam rate of just 0.3%. In concrete terms, this reliable functioning is estimated to have saved between 12 and 15 American lives during Market Garden alone. Yet, no recognition was granted. Officially, it was as if the improvements had never existed. Command remained silent, for reasons both practical and political. Acknowledging the effectiveness of modified carbines would be admitting the factory specifications were inadequate in actual combat conditions. It would expose failures in production, design, and oversight. Political implications loomed large. Contracts with manufacturers, funding, congressional scrutiny. Legal concerns also weighed heavily. A soldier had altered government property without authorization. Recognizing success might open a legal inquiry, raise questions about liability, or require explanations that bureaucracies were unwilling to offer in wartime. It was simply easier to ignore than explain. The maxim became clear. If it's not broken, don't fix the paperwork. Lives were quietly saved. Regulations remained unchallenged. The War Department allowed the paradox to persist. Effectiveness in the field was celebrated silently, while official records, statistics, and commendations ignored the ingenuity that had made the difference between life and death. Gallagher's 52 minutes of illegal work remained a secret, known only to those who had witnessed its results and to the soldiers who survived because of it. Operation Market Garden lasted from September 17th to September 25th, 1944. 8 days of fierce, chaotic fighting across the Dutch countryside. The statistics from that operation remain archived in reports, typed in fading ink, buried in file cabinets that outlived most of the motics, men involved. They reveal a pattern that command never acknowledged publicly, yet could never fully ignore. Across the entire 82nd Airborne Division, a total of 347 carbine malfunctions were officially reported during the operation. Most were attributed to failure to extract, failure to cycle, or failure to fire conditions caused by mud, carbon fouling, and mechanical stress under rapid firing. The standard response from ordnance officers labelled them as expected combat failures. But to paratroopers under fire from German machine guns, these failures were not expected. They were deadly. Within the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 89 of those malfunctions were reported. That number stood out, not because it was high, but because Easy Company, the company with 27 modified carbines, reported only 7 malfunctions in total. None of those 7 came from the modified weapons. Not one modified carbine failed. In battlefield environments that clogged standard rifles within minutes, the altered weapons continued to fire, cycle, and protect. The difference was not theoretical. It was not academic or statistical. It was practical, brutal, and immediate. A functional weapon meant the difference between covering your buddy's advance or watching him fall. It meant holding a crossroads long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It meant, quite simply, living long enough to see another dawn. A conservative military analysis, one that avoided exaggeration, estimated between 12 and 15 American lives directly saved during Market Garden because of the reliability of these modified carbines. The estimate widened when including non-fatal outcomes. Approximately 20 to 25 wounds likely prevented because fire support remained intact during German counterattacks. And those numbers applied only to Market Garden. They did not account for later engagements in the Netherlands, in the Ardennes, and beyond. The principle behind it all was deceptively simple. 0.01, 3 inches of additional drilling replaced hesitation with certainty. One carefully stretched coil of spring transformed, choked, sluggish cycling into clean, rhythmical function. 0.020 inches of filing on a trigger group converted random, scattered fire into deliberate, effective accuracy. These changes were measured in thousandths of an inch, but felt in the steady certainty of a weapon that would not betray its operator. Total material cost: $0. Gallagher used what was already available, no replacement parts, no custom fabrications, just re-engineering of what existed. Total time, cost, 52 minutes per weapon. Not 52 hours, not 52 days, 52 minutes. Less than 1 hour to turn a standard factory product into a field-tested, soldier-approved lifeline. But the total life cost and life value? Impossible to measure. It is important to note that the modifications did not turn the carbine into a new weapon. They fulfilled what the weapon had promised to be from the beginning. Gallagher did not redesign. He completed. He restored the weapon's intended purpose, to function reliably, accurately, predictably, under real battlefield conditions, not just under controlled factory trials. The broader implication extended beyond the 508th or even the 82nd Airborne. It raised uncomfortable questions that no one in the Army Ordnance Department wanted written down. If a machinist from Dearborn could, in 52 minutes, reduce weapon failure from 2.5% to 0.3%, what did that mean about the manufacturing standards applied across hundreds of thousands of weapons? What did it mean about cost-optimizing contracts, about Congress, about inspections that had signed off on production batches with known limitations? It meant something powerful. Sometimes, innovation in war does not come from research labs, or from engineers in offices, or from doctrine developers. Sometimes it comes from dirt-covered hands, from decades of inherited craft, from the fusion of field necessity and technical intuition. A small modification, a massive impact. It wasn't magic. It was understanding. Understanding that machines built to protect life could, if slightly improved, fulfill that purpose better. Understanding that a fraction of an inch could determine whether a mechanism failed or succeeded. Understanding that reliability is not a luxury in battle, it is everything. Gallagher never patented anything. He never documented his process. He never claimed credit. But his legacy is written not in blueprints or manuals. It is written in lives continued, in letters that were sent home, in empty seats that were never needed at folded flag funerals. In thousandths of an inch, in 52 minutes, in the countless lives carried forward by those who survived. Reliability was never an accident. It was a choice made by a soldier with a file, a drill, a spring, and a purpose. Thomas Gallagher survived Market Garden, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final push into Germany. He was discharged in November 1945 at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, and returned to Dearborn, Michigan, to the life he had left behind. Officially, his decorations included the Good Conduct Medal, the Bronze Star for unrelated actions, and the Combat Infantry Badge. There was no recognition for the carbine modifications that had saved at least a dozen lives. By December 1945, he was rehired at the Ford River Rouge plant, returning to the same machinist work, the same precision tolerances, the same metal and measurement that had guided his hands before the war. Among co-workers, he was known as a veteran of the Airborne, but the details of Market Garden and the modifications remained unspoken. When asked about the war, he said simply, "Did my job. Came home." The only time he spoke publicly of the carbine was in 1983, on Veterans Day. A local newspaper interviewed him along with other World War II veterans. When asked about Market Garden, he mentioned, briefly, that he had fixed guns for his squad. The reporter did not grasp the significance, and did not follow up. The article noted nothing about technical changes, operational impact, or lives saved. Gallagher never considered himself a hero. "Just made the gun work the way it should have worked from the factory," he said. When pressed, he added, "Other guys did the dying. I just filed some metal." He refused to criticize the Army Ordnance Department, insisting they were doing their best, and always credited Sergeant Bill Hayes, who had lent him the tools. He married Patricia O'Brien in 1947 and had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. He worked at Ford until retirement in 1984. Thomas Gallagher died in February 1998 at the age of 77. His obituary mentioned his military service, his machinist career, and his family, but contained zero mention of the modification that had saved 15 lives. The story of Thomas Gallagher's carbine modifications did not end with Market Garden. Officially, the M1 Carbine remained unchanged. The Army never adopted the alterations he had devised, never conducted a formal study of field modifications, and never acknowledged the lives saved. Post-war analyses overlooked the lessons hiding in the mud of the Netherlands. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, soldiers carried the same weapons, encountering the same failures under wet, cold, and rugged conditions. Similarly, during the Vietnam War, the M16's gas system revealed comparable flaws, and frontline soldiers improvised unauthorized fixes to keep their weapons operational. The pattern repeated itself. Institutional resistance confronted field innovation. Regulations, manuals, and production standards existed in a controlled, peacetime framework, but they could not anticipate the realities of combat. Soldiers, desperate to survive, improvised solutions. They tested, measured, and adjusted in the field, often at personal risk, knowing that malfunctioning weapons could cost lives instantly. The truth Gallagher demonstrated is simple yet profound. Frontline soldiers often understand their weapons better than factory engineers because their tests are measured in survival, not in laboratory conditions. What works in California, in controlled firing ranges, does not necessarily function in Dutch, mud under rain, cold, and enemy fire. Gallagher's modifications were small: a drilled gas port, a clipped spring, a filed sear. Yet their impact was massive: 0 malfunctions in critical engagements, lives saved, and positions held. These improvements did not require new materials, additional budgets, or official, sanction-only observation, skill, and the willingness to act when rules failed. The broader truth goes beyond one paratrooper. It is about thousands of soldiers who noticed the shortcomings of their equipment, about hundreds who improvised and fixed them, about dozens who were punished for doing so, and about the few who survived, lucky enough to carry their stories home unrecognized. Gallagher's work stands as a quiet testament to ingenuity, courage, and practical problem-solving. It reminds us that innovation in war often comes from necessity, not bureaucracy, and that the rules written in safety and comfort do not always survive the mud, rain, and gunfire of battle. In the end, the legacy is not in medals or manuals. It is in lives continued, in trust earned, and in the silent proof that, sometimes, breaking the rules is the only way to make them work. The final image of Thomas Gallagher's contribution is quiet, almost mundane. His carbine, serial number 5194823, was turned in at the war's end, in November 1945. It was sent to a depot, inspected by men who followed procedure with meticulous precision, yet never noticed the subtle modifications that had made it exceptional. The enlarged gas port, the clipped spring, the filed trigger, none were recorded, none preserved. Most likely, the rifle was scrapped or sold as surplus, destined to vanish into obscurity. There would be no museum display, no plaques, no historical preservation. Just a tool that had worked when it needed to work, in the mud and rain of the Netherlands, keeping men alive when every other factor in the battle threatened to fail them. The real story of Market Garden is one of failure. Bridges were not taken, Arnhem was lost, and history largely remembers the operational defeat. Yet, hidden within the failure is another story. The story of a machinist who spent 52 minutes with a drill bit, a file, and a spring, ensuring that 15 men could rely on their weapons under fire. Gallagher's quiet innovation was no different from the unnoticed acts of McKenna, Donovan, and Thatch men who saw a problem, fixed it, and saved lives without waiting for permission, recognition, or approval. He demonstrated the fundamental principle of combat engineering: see the problem, fix the problem, and trust in the solution. What matters most is the human outcome. Gallagher died in February 1998 at the age of 77. Among the 11 men for whom he modified carbines, 9 survived the war. Santos, Dietz, Chen, and the others returned home, married, raised families, and lived full lives. Their survival was inseparable from Gallagher's work: the hours he spent in a dark barn, the risk of court-martial, the careful adjustments made by hand to a weapon that had been failing them in combat. It is a testament to the truth that regulations do not stop bullets, and bureaucracy does not ensure survival. Innovation in war does not emerge from committees, manuals, or testing labs. It emerges from necessity, from observation, and from the willingness of a soldier or a machinist to act when lives are on the line. It emerges from private hands, dirt under fingernails, and the precise measurement of thousandths of an inch that make the difference between life and death. Gallagher's story reminds us that war is not only fought in grand strategies or epic battles. It is fought in quiet moments of ingenuity, in practical problem-solving, in defiance of rules written for peacetime conditions, and in the willingness to act decisively when no one is watching. His 52 minutes in a Dutch barn ensured that men returned home, that lives continued, and that history, though it largely ignores him, owes a debt to the mechanic who saw a problem and refused to let it kill his friends. That is how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or engineering committees, through privates and machinists who see problems, find solutions, and do not wait for permission to keep their friends alive. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.